There is a moment in the spiritual journey that almost no one talks about openly. A moment when you are doing everything right. You are praying more. You are becoming more aware. You feel closer to God than you ever have before. And yet, strangely, this is the exact moment when temptation intensifies, when old desires resurface, when the flesh seems louder, stronger, more aggressive than ever. Many people misunderstand this moment. They assume something is wrong. They believe they are failing. Some even think God has withdrawn. But the truth is far deeper and far more unsettling for the flesh itself. When God draws near, the illusion that the flesh depends on begins to collapse. The comfort of unconscious living starts to break. The old patterns that once ruled without resistance suddenly face exposure. And nothing fights harder than something that knows it is losing control. The flesh does not resist when it dominates silently. It resists when its authority is threatened. That is why moments of spiritual clarity are often accompanied by internal battles that feel disproportionate, confusing, and exhausting. If you are listening to this and you feel like the struggle has intensified precisely because you are closer to God, not farther from Him, you are not imagining things. This resistance is not proof of weakness. It is evidence of awakening. What you are experiencing is not abandonment. It is proximity. And understanding this changes everything. Because once you see why the flesh fights hardest when God is near, you stop blaming yourself for the war, and you start winning it. The flesh is not simply desire. It is an identity built on separation from God. It survives on unconsciousness, on routine, on distraction, on the absence of awareness. As long as a person lives without deep reflection, without spiritual alignment, without truth confronting their inner world, the flesh operates effortlessly. It does not need to shout. It does not need to seduce aggressively. It rules quietly, shaping habits, impulses, reactions, and choices without ever being questioned. But when God draws near, something fundamental changes. Nearness to God is not merely emotional comfort or religious enthusiasm, it is illumination. It exposes motives. It reveals attachments. It brings clarity where confusion once lived, and clarity is dangerous to the flesh. Because the flesh cannot survive being seen clearly. It thrives only in shadow. This is why the battle does not begin when you are far from God. It begins when you start to see, when you start to feel convicted instead of condemned. When silence becomes uncomfortable because truth begins to surface, when the old distractions no longer satisfy the way they once did, the flesh interprets this as a threat to its existence, and threats provoke defense. The reason the flesh fights hardest when God is near is because God's presence weakens the illusion that the flesh is necessary. Near God, you begin to realize that many of the things you thought you needed were only substitutes. The flesh depended on those substitutes. Lust replaces intimacy. Control replaces trust. Comfort replaces surrender. Pride replaces identity. When God approaches, those replacements start to lose their power, and the flesh reacts with urgency. This urgency often manifests as intensified temptation. Thoughts become louder. Old habits return with force. Desires that seem dormant suddenly feel overwhelming. This is not regression. This is resistance. The flesh is not stronger than before. It is desperate, and desperation makes noise. There is also a psychological dimension to this battle that many spiritual people ignore. When awareness increases, suppressed patterns rise to the surface. God's nearness does not create these impulses, it reveals them. Light does not invent darkness, it exposes it. The flesh interprets exposure as danger because exposure leads to transformation, and transformation leads to loss of control. This is why people often experience their most intense internal conflicts right before major spiritual breakthroughs. The flesh senses the shift before the mind understands it. It knows its authority is slipping, so it throws everything it has into the moment, hoping to pull you back into old cycles before the transformation completes. Another reason the flesh fights hardest near God is because proximity demands surrender. You cannot remain close to God while maintaining full control over your inner life. Nearness requires honesty. It requires letting go of identities built on fear, pleasure, or self-protection. The flesh does not oppose morality as much as it opposes surrender. It can tolerate rules. It cannot tolerate loss of sovereignty. When God is distant in your awareness, the flesh can coexist with religious behavior. You can pray mechanically, you can follow routines, you can speak spiritual language while remaining internally unchanged. But when God is near, those masks fall apart. Nearness demands alignment, not performance. And the flesh is terrified of alignment because alignment exposes contradiction. This is why the battle often feels internal rather than external. You are not being attacked by circumstances. You are being confronted by truth. The conflict is not between you and God. It is between who you are becoming and who the flesh needs you to remain. Understanding this reframes the entire struggle. You stop asking, "Why am I like this?" and start asking, "What is being threatened?" And the answer is always the same. The old self cannot survive where God is near. The flesh fights hardest, not because it is winning, but because it is losing. And the intensity of the fight is proportional to the closeness of God's presence. The closer you are, the louder the resistance becomes. This is not punishment. It is confirmation. Something real is changing. If this message resonates with you, if you feel this battle intensifying in your own life, understand this. You are not broken, and you are not alone. You are standing at the edge of transformation. Do not retreat because of resistance. Resistance is the sound of chains breaking. If this message is helping you see your spiritual struggle more clearly, subscribe to the channel now. These teachings are for those who are serious about walking in truth, understanding the battle within, and learning how to live beyond the control of the flesh. When God draws near, the battle intensifies, because the flesh understands something the conscious mind often does not yet fully grasp. Proximity to God rearranges authority. It changes who is in command. For a long time, the flesh ruled by default, not because it was strong, but because it was unchallenged. It shaped desires, reactions, emotional habits, and identity quietly without resistance. But God's nearness disrupts that silent rule. It introduces a higher authority that the flesh cannot negotiate with, cannot manipulate, and cannot coexist with comfortably. The flesh survives on autonomy. It needs to believe that it decides what feels good, what feels safe, what feels necessary. When God approaches, that illusion begins to fracture, not because God imposes force, but because truth carries weight. Near God, you begin to sense that not every desire deserves obedience, not every impulse speaks truth, not every comfort leads to life. This awareness is intolerable to the flesh because it undermines its primary weapon, unquestioned obedience. This is why the flesh does not attack first through actions, but through thoughts and emotions. It floods the inner world with urgency, confusion, and intensity. It creates a sense that something must be resolved immediately, that you must act now, indulge now, escape now. This urgency is artificial. It is not born from need, but from fear. The flesh fears stillness because stillness allows God's voice to be heard, and God's voice does not argue with the flesh. It dissolves its authority. Another reason the flesh fights harder when God is near is because divine proximity accelerates inner honesty. When God is distant in awareness, self-deception is easy. You can justify behaviors, minimize patterns, and rationalize attachments. But closeness to God removes the fog. You begin to see not only what you do, but why you do it. Motives surface. Hidden dependencies are revealed. Emotional contracts you made with pain, pleasure, or control come into the light. The flesh depends on those hidden agreements. Exposure threatens its survival. This exposure often feels uncomfortable, even painful, because it strips away the stories you told yourself to feel safe. The flesh does not only cling to sin, it clings to identity. It wants you to believe you are your impulses, your fears, your history, your cravings. God's nearness challenges that belief. It introduces a deeper identity that is not governed by reaction, but by truth. And when identity shifts, power shifts. That is why many people feel a strange contradiction during spiritual growth. Increased peace alongside increased conflict. On one level, there is a quiet assurance, a sense of being guided, protected, seen. On another level, there is agitation, restlessness, temptation, and inner noise. This does not mean the peace is false. It means the flesh is unsettled by it. Peace threatens chaos because peace reveals that chaos was never necessary. The flesh also fights harder because God's nearness interrupts old reward systems. For a long time, the flesh trained the brain to associate relief, pleasure, and escape with certain behaviors. These behaviors became coping mechanisms. They were not just habits, they were emotional anesthetics. Near God, these anesthetics lose effectiveness. What once numbed pain now feels empty. What once satisfied now feels hollow. The flesh panics when its tools stop working. This panic is why temptation can feel more aggressive than ever. The flesh is trying to reassert control before the old systems collapse entirely. It wants to pull you back into familiar cycles because familiarity feels like survival. Even destructive patterns can feel safer than transformation because they are predictable. God's nearness introduces the unknown, and the flesh equates the unknown with danger. There is also a deeper spiritual truth here that many overlook. Closeness to God strengthens the spirit, and a strengthened spirit resists the flesh naturally. Resistance exposes weakness. The flesh was never as powerful as it appeared. It was simply uncontested. When the spirit awakens, the imbalance becomes obvious. The flesh responds not with confidence, but with aggression, because aggression is the last refuge of a losing force. This is why the struggle can feel so personal. The flesh does not just want obedience, it wants identification. It wants you to believe its voice is your voice. When God is near, you begin to distinguish between the two. You start to observe thoughts instead of obeying them automatically. You start to feel desires without surrendering to them immediately. This separation terrifies the flesh because separation leads to disempowerment. Another crucial reason the flesh fights harder is because God's nearness invites surrender rather than effort. The flesh understands effort. It can work harder. It can strive. It can perform. But surrender removes its leverage. Near God, the path forward is not domination, but yielding. Not control, but trust. Not proving, but resting. The flesh does not know how to survive in surrender because surrender hands authority to God. This is why religious striving often feels safer to the flesh than genuine intimacy with God. Striving keeps the ego intact. Intimacy dissolves it. When God is near, performance becomes meaningless. What matters is alignment. And alignment requires letting go of the inner resistance that the flesh is built upon. Many people misinterpret this phase and retreat. They think the intensity means they are doing something wrong. In reality, the intensity means the old order is collapsing. The flesh does not fight when it is winning. It fights when its time is ending. The closer God is, the less room the flesh has to operate unseen. Understanding this allows you to stop reacting emotionally to the struggle. You no longer panic when temptation rises. You no longer assume failure when old thoughts return. Instead, you observe the pattern. You recognize the timing. You see the resistance for what it is, confirmation that transformation is underway. This does not make the battle painless, but it makes it meaningful. You stop trying to silence the flesh through force and start starving it through non-identification. You stop arguing with thoughts and start refusing to obey them. You let God's presence do the work that effort never could. The flesh fights hardest when God is near, because nearness dismantles illusion, exposes identity, interrupts old rewards, and transfers authority. This fight is not a sign that God is withdrawing. It is a sign that He is close enough to matter. If you are walking through this season right now, do not turn back. Do not numb yourself. Do not seek comfort in old habits. Stay present, stay honest, stay near. The noise will not last forever. The flesh cannot survive sustained exposure to truth. If this teaching is helping you understand your inner battle and giving you clarity instead of shame, subscribe to the channel now. These messages are for those who are ready to walk through resistance, not run from it, and to grow into the freedom that only truth can bring. There is a moment in every genuine spiritual awakening when the inner conflict stops being abstract and becomes personal. It is no longer just about temptation in general or vague struggles with discipline or desire. It becomes intimate, precise, almost targeted. The flesh does not fight randomly when God is near. It fights strategically. It aims at the places where identity is forming, where surrender is beginning, where trust is being built. This is why the battle can feel so specific, so tailored, so emotionally charged that it shakes your confidence and makes you question whether you are truly strong enough to continue. The flesh understands timing. It knows that when God is near, your spirit is becoming more sensitive, more receptive, more aware. Sensitivity, however, is a double-edged sword. It allows you to perceive truth more clearly, but it also means emotional reactions can feel amplified. The flesh exploits this window. It uses heightened sensitivity to create doubt, guilt, nostalgia, fear, and internal pressure. Not because these emotions are stronger than God, but because they feel more immediate than trust when you are in transition. One of the most overlooked aspects of this phase is how the flesh weaponizes memory. When God is near and your future identity is beginning to form, the flesh pulls you backward. It replays old images, sensations, experiences, and emotional highs. It reminds you of who you were, what you felt, what you enjoyed. Not because those things were meaningful, but because familiarity creates emotional gravity. The flesh wants to anchor you to the past, so you never fully step into the present transformation. This is why temptation often comes wrapped in nostalgia. It is not always raw desire. Sometimes it is longing. Sometimes it is comfort. Sometimes it is the illusion of belonging. The flesh says, you were someone there. You mattered there. You felt alive there. God's nearness, however, is calling you into a new identity that has not yet fully stabilized. The flesh exploits that instability, hoping you will retreat to what feels known instead of trusting what is true. Another reason the flesh fights harder at this stage is because God's nearness disrupts emotional shortcuts. For a long time, emotions were used as decision makers. If it felt good, it was followed. If it felt uncomfortable, it was avoided. Near God, this pattern breaks. You begin to act from alignment rather than impulse. You begin to tolerate discomfort without immediately escaping it. This is devastating to the flesh because emotional avoidance is one of its primary survival tools. When you stop running from discomfort, the flesh loses leverage. So it increases the intensity of discomfort, hoping you will break. It magnifies restlessness. It amplifies loneliness. It sharpens desire. It creates internal pressure that says, this is too much. You cannot sit with this. You need relief now. But this pressure is not a command. It is a test of allegiance. God's nearness invites you to stay present without reacting. The flesh demands reaction. That is the core difference. The flesh cannot survive in presence because presence exposes its mechanisms. It thrives in compulsion, not awareness. Every time you feel an impulse rise and you do not immediately obey it, the flesh weakens. Every time you feel discomfort and do not escape it, the flesh loses ground. This is why the battle at this stage often feels exhausting. It is not because you are failing. It is because you are no longer operating on autopilot. Awareness requires energy. Consciousness demands participation. The flesh prefers unconscious obedience. God invites conscious trust. That transition is tiring, but it is also irreversible once it begins. There is also a deeper fear driving the flesh at this stage, the fear of irrelevance. Near God, you begin to experience moments where the flesh's voice is no longer the loudest. You sense guidance that is quieter but steadier. You feel conviction without condemnation. You begin to understand that you are not your thoughts, not your urges, not your emotional storms. This realization is fatal to the flesh's claim to identity. So the flesh responds by attempting to reassert itself as essential. It says, "Without me, you will be empty. Without me, you will lose pleasure. Without me, you will be alone." These are lies rooted in dependency. The flesh does not offer life, it offers distraction from life. God's nearness reveals this distinction, and the flesh fights to keep it hidden. Another tactic the flesh uses is spiritual discouragement. It whispers that you should be further along by now, that if God were truly near, the struggle would already be over, that real faith would not feel this hard. This is a subtle but powerful deception because it turns growth into accusation. It makes progress feel like failure simply because the process is uncomfortable. In truth, the discomfort is evidence of growth. When something is dying, it resists. When an old identity is dissolving, it clings. The flesh's resistance is not proof that God is absent. It is proof that something is being removed. The pain is not punishment. It is separation. At this stage, the greatest danger is not temptation itself, but misinterpretation. If you believe the struggle means you are weak, you will fight yourself. If you believe it means God is distant, you will withdraw. But if you understand that the struggle means transformation is active, you will endure without panic. God does not ask you to overpower the flesh through force. He invites you to outlast it through faith. The flesh burns fast. It demands immediate satisfaction. God works slowly. He builds endurance. The flesh cannot survive patience. It needs urgency. Every time you choose patience over reaction, the flesh starves. This is why silence becomes so important at this stage. Not external silence, but internal silence. The ability to observe without engaging, to feel without obeying, to wait without fleeing. Silence is terrifying to the flesh because it removes stimulation, it creates space, and in that space, God speaks. The flesh will tell you that silence is dangerous, boring, unbearable. God reveals that silence is where freedom is forged, not dramatic freedom, not emotional highs, but deep stability. The kind of freedom that does not depend on circumstances or sensations. As this stage continues, you may notice something subtle but powerful. The temptations lose their authority even if they still appear. The urges may arise, but they no longer define you. The thoughts may surface, but they no longer command you. This is the beginning of true dominion, not through control, but through detachment. The flesh fights hardest here because it senses the point of no return approaching. Once you stop identifying with it, its reign ends. It may still exist, but it no longer rules. God's nearness makes this shift possible, not by force, but by truth. If you are walking through this phase and feel tired, confused, or internally pressured, understand this: you are not failing. You are crossing a threshold. Do not rush it. Do not dramatize it. Stay present, stay honest, stay near. If this message is helping you recognize the deeper dynamics of your inner battle and giving you strength to endure without shame, subscribe to the channel now. These teachings are for those who are not running from the process, but walking through it with clarity, patience, and faith. As God's nearness deepens, the battle with the flesh reaches a quieter but more decisive stage. This is the phase where the struggle is no longer loud temptation or emotional turbulence alone, but something far more subtle and dangerous: negotiation. The flesh, realizing that brute force is failing, shifts strategy. It stops shouting and starts reasoning. It no longer says, "Do this now," but whispers, "Just this once, you deserve this, you can deal with it later." This won't affect your relationship with God. This is the most deceptive phase of all, because it feels reasonable, calm, even spiritual on the surface. The flesh understands that when God is near, you are less likely to obey raw impulse. So it disguises itself as wisdom, balance, self-care, even grace. It does not attack God directly. It attempts to reinterpret him. It suggests a version of God that is convenient, permissive, and distant enough to allow compromise without consequence. This is not rebellion. It is dilution. And dilution is often more effective than opposition. At this stage, the flesh is no longer trying to pull you completely away from God. It is trying to keep you from fully surrendering. Partial surrender keeps the flesh alive. Compartmentalization becomes its favorite tool. You give God your prayers, but not your habits. You give him your words, but not your private thoughts. You give him your worship, but not your attachments. The flesh thrives in these untouched spaces. This is why this stage can feel confusing. You may still feel close to God. You may still experience moments of peace and insight. Yet something feels unresolved. There is an underlying tension, a sense that you are holding back without fully knowing why. The flesh hides in this ambiguity. It knows that clarity would expose it. God's nearness at this stage often manifests as gentle pressure rather than intense confrontation. Convictions become quieter but more persistent. The same thoughts return, not with urgency, but with consistency. The same inner invitations surface again and again. Let go, trust more, stop feeding this pattern, stop justifying this behavior. The flesh responds by delaying. Delay is its final defense. Delay feels harmless. It sounds patient. It claims maturity. But delay is disobedience disguised as caution. The flesh knows that tomorrow is its ally. Tomorrow allows habits to survive. Tomorrow keeps surrender theoretical. God's nearness, however, is always now. Truth does not wait. It invites response in the present moment. This is also the stage where the flesh exploits spiritual language. It uses scripture selectively. It emphasizes grace while ignoring transformation. It speaks of freedom while clinging to bondage. It reframes conviction as condemnation and surrender as extremism. The flesh is not afraid of religion. It is afraid of transformation. Religion can be managed. Transformation cannot. Another reason the flesh fights harder here is because your external life may begin to change. As God draws near internally, alignment starts affecting decisions, relationships, priorities, and boundaries. Things you once tolerated become uncomfortable. Conversations you once avoided become necessary. Environments that once felt normal begin to feel draining. The flesh resists these shifts because they threaten its external support system. The flesh does not exist in isolation. It is reinforced by surroundings, routines, and relationships that feed its identity. God's nearness exposes these reinforcements. You begin to sense that certain spaces weaken you, not because they are evil, but because they keep you asleep. This realization is painful because it often involves letting go of familiarity, comfort, and even people. At this stage, the flesh introduces fear of loss. It says, if you go further, you will lose connection. You will become lonely, or you will be misunderstood. You will no longer belong. These fears are not entirely false in the short term. Transformation often involves separation, but the flesh exaggerates the cost while hiding the reward. What the flesh never tells you is what it costs to stay the same. It never mentions the slow erosion of peace, the quiet dissatisfaction, the internal division that comes from partial obedience. God's nearness makes these costs visible. You begin to feel the weight of misalignment more clearly than before. What once felt tolerable now feels heavy. This heaviness is not punishment. It is sensitivity. As alignment increases, dissonance becomes unbearable. The flesh interprets this as cruelty. God reveals it as mercy. He is not making life harder. He is making misalignment impossible to ignore. This is also where many people attempt to bargain with God. They promise future obedience in exchange for present comfort. They say, once this season passes, I will change. Once I feel stronger, I will let go. Once things stabilize, I will surrender fully. The flesh loves these bargains because they postpone transformation indefinitely. God does not bargain because truth does not negotiate. He does not force, but he does not dilute. His nearness remains steady, inviting alignment without coercion. This steady presence is what ultimately exhausts the flesh. The flesh thrives on intensity, reaction, and drama. God operates through consistency. Over time, if you remain near God without retreating or rationalizing, something remarkable happens. The negotiations lose their emotional charge. The arguments feel repetitive and hollow. The justifications sound weak even as they arise. The flesh continues to speak, but its voice lacks authority. This is not because you defeated it through effort, but because you stopped feeding it through compromise. This stage teaches a crucial lesson. Freedom is not won through dramatic decisions alone, but through quiet consistency. Each time you choose alignment over justification, the flesh weakens. Each time you respond to conviction with humility instead of explanation, its grip loosens. Each time you accept discomfort instead of escaping it, you reclaim territory. God's nearness at this stage feels less emotional and more stabilizing. You may not feel constant spiritual highs. Instead, you feel grounded, centered, clear. The flesh interprets this lack of drama as emptiness. In truth, it is peace taking root. The flesh fights hardest here because it senses that its influence is becoming optional. Once obedience is no longer driven by fear or pressure, but by clarity, the flesh loses relevance. It can no longer manipulate you through intensity or urgency. It becomes background noise instead of a commander. If you are in this stage and feel torn between surrender and delay, understand that the tension you feel is not confusion. It is clarity forming. Do not rush it, but do not negotiate with it. Stay honest, stay present, stay near. If this teaching is helping you recognize the subtle ways the flesh resists and giving you clarity to choose alignment over compromise, subscribe to the channel now. These messages are for those who are moving beyond surface-level faith and into a life shaped by truth, consistency, and genuine freedom. There comes a final stage in this inner war where the flesh no longer fights to win, but fights to leave a mark. This is the phase few people recognize while they are inside it, because the struggle feels quieter, heavier, and strangely reflective. The flesh is no longer trying to dominate your future. It is trying to shape your memory of the past and your interpretation of the journey. It wants to control the narrative of what happened so that even if it loses authority, it can still influence how you see yourself, God, and the transformation you are undergoing. At this stage, God's nearness is no longer something you merely feel. It becomes something you trust even when feeling fades. And this is precisely what the flesh cannot tolerate. The flesh thrives on sensation. It depends on emotional highs and lows to justify its presence. When faith becomes steady instead of dramatic, when obedience becomes natural instead of forced, the flesh loses its last stronghold, relevance. So it shifts its attack inward toward meaning. It asks questions that sound deep but are rooted in resistance. Was all this struggle worth it? Did you really change, or did you just suppress yourself? Are you truly closer to God, or did you just lose parts of yourself? These questions are not invitations to reflection. They are attempts to reinsert doubt into stability. The flesh wants you to mourn what you released. It wants you to romanticize the old self. It wants you to believe that something essential was lost, instead of something false being removed. This is why memories can feel emotionally charged again at this stage, even after you thought you had moved on. The flesh replays them not to pull you back into behavior, but to pull you back into identification. God's nearness, however, reveals something crucial here. What you released was never life. It was compensation. It was survival masquerading as identity. When God draws close, He does not take life away. He removes substitutes that were never meant to sustain you. This is also the stage where spiritual maturity is tested most deeply. Earlier stages tested discipline, endurance, and resistance. This stage tests humility and patience. The flesh tries to provoke pride or discouragement. It says, "Look how far you've come," hoping pride will replace dependence. Or it says, "You're still struggling," hoping discouragement will replace gratitude. Both are traps. Pride and discouragement are two sides of the same self-centered coin. God's nearness invites something far simpler and far more difficult. Quiet faithfulness. No proving, no dramatizing, no narrating the struggle endlessly, just presence, just obedience, just trust. The flesh finds this unbearable because it removes drama, and drama is how it keeps attention on itself. Another subtle tactic the flesh uses at this stage is comparison. It urges you to measure your journey against others. It points out people who seem freer, stronger, happier, or more disciplined. Or it points to those who seem weaker, hoping to inflate ego. Comparison pulls attention outward. God's nearness draws attention inward. The flesh wants you looking anywhere but where truth is forming. This is also where many people experience a strange sense of emptiness and misinterpret it as loss. In reality, this emptiness is space. Space where old noise used to live. Space where compulsions once ruled. Space where identity was crowded with fear and desire. The flesh calls this emptiness boredom, meaninglessness, or numbness. God calls it rest. Learning to live in this space is one of the final deaths of the flesh, because the flesh equates stillness with non-existence. It believes that if something is not stimulating, it is not alive. God reveals the opposite. Life begins when noise ends. At this stage, obedience no longer feels heroic. It feels ordinary. Temptation may still appear, but it feels distant, almost irrelevant. The flesh hates irrelevance more than defeat. Defeat allows drama. Irrelevance removes purpose. This is why the last attempts of the flesh often feel strangely hollow. The urges arise, but they lack conviction. The arguments surface, but they sound tired. The fear appears, but it no longer paralyzes. This is not because you became stronger than the flesh through willpower. It is because you stopped feeding it attention. Attention is the flesh's oxygen. God's nearness teaches you how to live without constantly reacting to inner noise. You begin to respond instead of react. You begin to listen instead of obey impulses. You begin to choose alignment without inner debate. One of the most important realizations at this stage is that freedom does not mean the absence of desire, but the absence of domination. Desires may arise, but they no longer decide. Thoughts may come, but they no longer define. Emotions may move, but they no longer rule. This is what it means to walk in the Spirit rather than be driven by the flesh. The flesh fights hardest near God because God reveals that the flesh was never the enemy in the way you imagined. It was a teacher of contrast. It showed you what life feels like without truth. But once the lesson is learned, the teacher must step aside. The flesh resists this transition because it confuses usefulness with permanence. God does not destroy the flesh violently. He outgrows it within you. He replaces its role. Where the flesh once provided identity, God provides truth. Where it once provided comfort, God provides peace. Where it once provided escape, God provides presence. This is why the final victory does not feel like triumph. It feels like relief. A deep, quiet relief. You are no longer at war with yourself. You are no longer negotiating every choice internally. You are no longer carrying the constant tension of divided allegiance. You are simply aligned. If you have reached this stage, or if you sense yourself approaching it, understand this. The battle is not ending because you are perfect, but because you are honest. Because you stopped pretending, because you stopped running, because you stayed near God even when nothing dramatic was happening. The flesh will always try one last time to convince you that the journey should have felt different. Ignore that voice. Transformation rarely looks impressive from the inside. It looks ordinary, stable, quiet. But this quiet is powerful. It is the quiet of a soul no longer enslaved by reaction. God's nearness does not remove struggle overnight, but it changes who you are while you struggle. And once identity shifts, authority follows. The flesh may still exist, but it no longer defines you. It no longer commands you. It no longer frightens you. If you have walked with me through this entire message, and it has brought clarity, strength, and peace to your understanding of the inner battle, subscribe to the channel now. These teachings are for those who are not chasing emotional religion, but seeking lasting transformation, steady faith, and a life shaped by truth rather than impulse.